Good evening, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we're setting the scene for an unlikely phobia, a fear so specific it could only belong to a man who possessed everything, the Roman Emperor. But before we get to the cricket, we must first sink into the profound, suffocating quiet of his world. Imagine, if you will, Rome at its zenith. A city of 1,000,000 souls, a vibrant, terrifying, and utterly deafening metropolis. By day, the air vibrated with the roar of the forum, the clamor of 1,000 blacksmiths, the shouts of merchants, and the grinding of chariot wheels on basalt roads. It was a cacophony that never truly stopped, even after sunset, as the working class still moved through the narrow, crowded streets. But none of that noise ever reached the emperor. The palace complex, particularly the Palatine Hill residence, was intentionally designed as an acoustic fortress. It stood physically elevated, a marble island floating above the grime and din of the world it ruled. Its foundations were thick, its walls were double-layered, and the chambers were vast, lined with polished marble and heavy tapestries, designed not only for luxury, but for sound dampening. The air within the imperial apartments was still, heavy, and strangely sterile, a silence that was less peaceful and more ominous. In the innermost private rooms, the silence was not merely the absence of sound, it was a curated, manufactured environment of sensory deprivation. The emperor, often alone, often awake, was a man completely detached from the natural rhythms of life. He didn't hear the wind rustling through normal trees. He heard only the gentle, calculated trickle of water features in a nearby nymphaeum, installed precisely to mask any unauthorized sound. The staff, too, were part of this enforced quietude. Slaves who served within the private quarters moved like ghosts in soft leather sandals. They communicated in hushed, almost internal whispers, knowing that a dropped amphora or a loudly cleared throat could mean a punishment far exceeding a simple dismissal. The air of the imperial palace carried a low, constant tension. The only person in the entire complex authorized to break the silence was the emperor himself. This was the environment that bred imperial paranoia. When a ruler holds absolute, terrifying power over the entire known world, their only real threats come from within, from a disloyal guard, a jealous advisor, or a resentful relative. The silence, therefore, became a trap. Every faint, unexpected sound was magnified, becoming a signal, a warning, or the possible scrape of a dagger being drawn from a sheath. The deep, insulating quiet of his palace turned the emperor's own mind into his biggest enemy, amplifying his worries and spinning every benign event into a grand political conspiracy. It is into this engineered, heavy, and terrifying silence, a silence of isolated power, not of peace, that we will soon introduce the smallest, most innocent noise imaginable, the high, insistent, and utterly uncontrollable chirp of a single cricket. The emperor had mastered the world, but he had lost control of his own quiet. Good evening, and welcome back to our quiet corner of history. Last time, we established the unnerving, heavy silence of the emperor's palace. Tonight, we turn our attention to the man who inhabited that silence, the most important man in the known world, and the simple, devastating truth that sleep evaded Rome's most important man. It is a common error to equate power with peace. The divus, the near god on earth, should logically be the most relaxed. Who could challenge him? Who could deny him anything, even rest? Yet, the historical record suggests that many Roman emperors, from Augustus to the later more volatile figures like Caligula and Nero, suffered from profound, crippling insomnia. Their gilded beds, draped in the finest silks, underfoot and the variability of food and temperature. Their senses were robust, constantly engaged in a necessary, vigorous dance with the chaotic world. A sudden shout, a barking dog, or a fly buzzing was simply background noise, an accepted part of life. The emperor, however, had spent years, perhaps decades, within a bubble of perfect curation. Acoustic isolation. He rarely heard a truly loud, sharp, or dissonant noise. His music was planned, his conversation muted, and the palace walls, as we've discussed, absorbed the exterior clamor. This led to a hypersensitization. The inner ear, deprived of normal stimulation, became too efficient. When a small, anomalous sound did occur, it hit the auditory nerves with the force of an alarm bell. Physical decadence. His skin was accustomed only to silk, his diet only to the finest, most easily digestible fare. There was no need to strain, to reach, or to endure any minor discomfort. This softness made him physically brittle, an exquisitely tuned instrument that could be thrown into immediate disarray by the smallest vibration. The emotional link. Most crucially, the emperor lacked the emotional context to categorize a minor irritation as just that. For the pauper, a buzzing fly is a nuisance. For the emperor, living in a constant state of fear, every deviation from the norm carried a political charge. The perfect silence was his achievement, a symbol of his control over his environment. A sound he could not control, a noise that penetrated the marble barrier, represented a failure of that control. It was not just a sound, it was a breach of security. This is why, for the emperor, a sound that a simplest farmer would ignore, the rhythmic, persistent, and entirely natural chirp of a field cricket, would become a source of genuine mental anguish. The cricket, a tiny creature guided by instinct, represented everything the emperor was not: natural, unconcerned with power, and utterly immune to imperial decree. His soft living had turned his palace into a velvet prison. He was comfortable, but desperately vulnerable. His hypersensitive nerves, accustomed only to the gentle lap of a fountain and the whisper of silk, were entirely unprepared for the sheer, insistent audacity of the natural world finally forcing its way in. It is this fragile state of hyper-awareness, a physical result of luxurious isolation, that sets the stage for the dramatic entrance of our tiny, musical antagonist. Good evening. We have now fully appreciated the enforced, vulnerable quiet of the palace and the delicate, anxiety-ridden mind of the emperor within it. We arrive now at the climax of our quiet drama. The night the cricket's chirp broke the silence of the golden house. The emperor lay in his vast, carved bed. He was not asleep. He was simply immobile, staring up at the gilded ceiling that depicted the triumph of a god who looked suspiciously like himself. The oil lamps had been carefully dimmed to a soft amber glow, casting long, peaceful shadows that his racing mind knew to distrust. The silence was perfect. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of an airless tomb, broken only by the barely perceptible sound of his own agitated breathing. He waited for a sound, a tremor in the floor, a muffled cough from the sentinel outside, anything to confirm the...
For the emperor, the cricket's chirp was not merely an irritating noise. It was an echo, a mimicry of his own internal chaos. The sound itself, a high, rapid staccato pulse, perfectly mirrored the rhythm of his racing heart, a heart that had not known genuine rest for years. Chirp, chirp, chirp. As he stood in the cold, oppressive stillness of his chamber, the emperor felt his own pulse quicken in a sudden, almost panicked response. The rapid beats in his chest seemed to sync up with the insect's call. He was listening to his own paranoia given an external voice. His body, trained for years to be hyper-alert to danger, interpreted the sound as a biological warning. Why was his heart beating so fast? Because danger was present. What was the danger? That relentless, insistent, rhythmic noise. His highly sophisticated mind, instead of rationally dismissing the sound as the call of Grilady, immediately searched for a deeper, political meaning. The consistency of the chirp was the most terrifying element. It was a precise, measured tick-tock, a metronome counting down to some unseen event. For a man obsessed with seizing and holding power, anything regular and predictable that he did not control was immediately suspicious. He began to interpret the pauses. 1. The beat, chirp, a statement of intent. 2. The pause, a moment for the conspirators to confirm the signal. 3. The repetition, chirp, chirp, confirmation that the plan was still on track. In his sleep-deprived, fearful state, the emperor was convinced he was listening to a secret military cadence, a prearranged signal for a legionary cohort to move into position, for a hidden trapdoor to open, or for the poisoned wine to be delivered. The little creature was, in his mind, the unwitting drummer of his own execution. This reaction is explained by the disconnection between the emperor and the natural world. Having replaced the noise of the forest with the silence of marble, he had lost the ability to distinguish between noise, random, harmless sound, and information, a sound meant to convey danger. Everything was information, everything was threat. The more he focused, the louder the chirp became, seeming to emanate from his own skull. He pressed his palms to his temples, trying to physically crush the sound, but it only intensified, vibrating deep in his core. The cricket had found the one exposed nerve in the Roman Empire's armor. It was a confrontation between ultimate human authority and the ultimate indifference of nature. The emperor could command the death of 1,000 men, but he could not command a single wild impulse of the living world to cease. The cricket sound was a constant, humiliating reminder that he was, at his most vulnerable, merely a panicked animal whose fear was being externalized by the rhythm of a tiny, unseen insect. The night wore on, the emperor pacing, the cricket chirping. The gap between his all-encompassing power and his immediate petty irritation grew into a terrifying chasm, all driven by the simple, unwavering connection between a cricket's simple song and the frantic, echoing beat of his own fear. Welcome back to the luxurious yet terrified world of the Roman emperor. Having established the agonizing rhythm of the cricket's chirp, a sound now fused with his own heartbeat of fear, we arrive at the emperor's defining, self-destructive question. Was it a natural sound or a secret signal?
The political subtext had consumed the natural sound. The emperor was convinced the cricket was not an insect. It was a tiny, relentless instrument of sedition, and the night was now a hostile communication network aimed directly at his heart. The hunt for a conspiracy that existed only in the emperor's mind was about to begin. Welcome back, listeners. We pause our unfolding drama inside the emperor's palace for a moment of quiet reflection, stepping out of the frantic chaos and into the serene, disciplined world of Roman philosophy. To understand the emperor's extreme reaction to a simple cricket, we must first ask how Roman philosophers viewed the noise of nature. During the height of the empire, the most influential schools of thought were Stoicism and Epicureanism. Both offered remedies for anxiety and fear, But their approaches to the natural world, including its simple sounds, were fundamentally different from the emperor's paranoid isolation. The Stoic perspective, acceptance and indifference. The Stoics, championed by figures like Seneca and Epictetus, would have viewed the cricket's chirp as an indifferent, something external to virtue and vice, and therefore external to a person's true well-being. To a Stoic, noise is merely vibration of air. The suffering it causes is not inherent in the chirp itself, but in the listener's judgment and resistance to it. The emperor's sleeplessness and panic were a direct result of his unreasonable desire for perfect silence and control. Seneca, who famously wrote to his friend Lucilius about the various distracting sounds in Rome, the shouts of hawkers, the clamor of the bathhouse, the chains of prisoners, preached radical acceptance. He argued that a philosopher must train his mind to be a fortress, immune to external sensory assaults. He would likely have scornfully advised the emperor, "If you cannot bear the sound of a cricket, how will you bear the sound of an army marching on Rome? Master your mind, not the insect." For the Stoic, the cricket was a tiny, relentless teacher, offering a perfect opportunity to practice tranquility, ataraxia. By wishing the cricket to be silent, the emperor was attempting to change the cosmos to suit his whim, a futile and foolish endeavor that guaranteed misery. The Epicureans, meanwhile, sought a life of pleasure, which they defined not as lavish indulgence, a mistake the emperor often made, but as freedom from pain and distress. They placed high value on the simple, natural world as a source of quiet joy. To an Epicurean like Lucretius, the chirp of the cricket was a piece of the natural harmony, a small, predictable part of the rhythm of the living world. The noise of nature was seen as inherently relaxing, a constant reminder that life goes on, independent of human anxiety or political maneuvering. They would argue that the emperor's problem stemmed from his total separation from nature. He had encased himself in gold and marble, filtering out the simple, grounding realities of the earth. The cricket was merely the sound of reality pushing back, attempting to remind the isolated ruler of the fundamental simplicity and permanence of the world beyond his court. For the Epicurean, the sound should have been a source of comfort, a lullaby of the physis.
Frustrated by the ineffectiveness of medicine, the emperor returned to the external threat. He ordered a specialized detachment to eradicate the source. The guards were instructed to silence the garden. This resulted in a ridiculous and tragic campaign of brute force against nature. They poured water into every crack and crevice, believing the sound traveled through the earth. They uprooted prized imported plants, tearing apart centuries of meticulous horticultural work. They scattered fine nets over the remaining shrubbery, desperately trying to catch an enemy they could barely see. Yet crickets are nenny, and the palace grounds were vast. Even as one was captured or crushed, another, further away, would take up the cadence. The emperor's massive effort produced only more rustling, more scraping, and ultimately more noise, a symphony of destruction that was far louder than the original chirp. By dawn, the gardens were a mess of overturned soil and ruined flowers. The guards were exhausted and covered in mud, and the emperor was still awake, staring out at the destruction, listening to the faint but still victorious chirp from a distant corner of the sprawling golden house. He had exerted his absolute authority and failed to conquer a single, tiny, insignificant creature. His power was absolute, but his control was a devastating illusion. Good evening, and welcome back to the restless, paranoid silence of the emperor's palace. The physical attempts to silence the cricket have failed, leaving the emperor exhausted and the gardens ruined. Having found no human assassin, the emperor's mind, fueled by insomnia and Roman dread, now turned to the only other explanation for the sound's persistence: the divine. Tonight we explore how superstition turned the chirp into a harbinger of doom. The Romans, despite their practical genius in law and engineering, were profoundly superstitious. Their entire political system, from the decision to hold a Senate meeting to the deployment of legions, was governed by omens, auspices, and the interpretation of signs. A powerful figure like the emperor was expected to be particularly attuned to these portents, as the fate of the entire empire rested on his ability to read the will of the gods. Lying awake after the disastrous garden search, the emperor began to filter the cricket's sound not as noise, nor as a signal, but as a divine message. The medium. Why would the gods choose a cricket? In Roman folklore, certain insects and birds were direct messengers. An owl hooting during the day, for instance, was a famous sign of impending death or disaster. The cricket's relentless, unwavering call was too perfect, too deliberate to be random. It was a humble creature that could easily penetrate the security of the Domus Aurea, exactly what the gods would use to remind the powerful man of his mortality. The sound meaning. The chirp was not harmonious, it was discordant, irritating, and insistent. The priests had taught that the gods communicated peace through harmony and warning through discord. The cricket's screeching rhythm was clearly a sound of divine displeasure, a piercing auditory judgment on some recent decree, some forgotten sacrifice, or some personal moral failure. The prophecy. The emperor's mind dredged up old grim nursery rhymes and warnings from the Vestal virgins. He remembered tales of a certain rhythmic clicking that preceded the catastrophic fire of Rome, or a similar incessant sound that announced the fall of a tyrannical king centuries ago. The cricket's rhythm was now the clock counting down to his own overthrow. It was the sound of fatum, a melody.
Frustrated by the ineffectiveness of medicine, the emperor returned to the external threat. He ordered a specialized detachment to eradicate the source. The guards were instructed to silence the garden. This resulted in a ridiculous and tragic campaign of brute force against nature. They poured water into every crack and crevice, believing the sound traveled through the earth. They uprooted prized imported plants, tearing apart centuries of meticulous horticultural work. They scattered fine nets over the remaining shrubbery, desperately trying to catch an enemy they could barely see. Yet, crickets are many, and the palace grounds were vast. Even as one was captured or crushed, another, further away, would take up the cadence. The emperor's massive effort produced only more rustling, more scraping, and ultimately more noise. A symphony of destruction that was far louder than the original chirp. By dawn, the gardens were a mess of overturned soil and ruined flowers. The guards were exhausted and covered in mud, and the emperor was still awake, staring out at the destruction, listening to the faint but still victorious chirp from a distant corner of the sprawling Golden House. He had exerted his absolute authority and failed to conquer a single, tiny, insignificant creature. His power was absolute, but his control was a devastating illusion. Good evening, and welcome back to the restless, paranoid silence of the Emperor's palace. The physical attempts to silence the cricket have failed, leaving the Emperor exhausted and the gardens ruined. Having found no human assassin, the Emperor's mind, fueled by insomnia and Roman dread, now turned to the only other explanation for the sound's persistence: the divine. Tonight, we explore how superstition turned the chirp into a harbinger of doom. The Romans, despite their practical genius in law and engineering, were profoundly superstitious. Their entire political system, from the decision to hold a Senate meeting to the deployment of legions, was governed by omens, auspices, and the interpretation of signs. A powerful figure like the emperor was expected to be particularly attuned to these portents, as the fate of the entire empire rested on his ability to read the will of the gods. Lying awake after the disastrous garden search, the emperor began to filter the cricket sound not as noise, nor as a signal, but as a divine message. The medium. Why would the gods choose a cricket? In Roman folklore, certain insects and birds were direct messengers. An owl hooting during the day, for instance, was a famous sign of impending death or disaster. The cricket's relentless, unwavering call was too perfect, too deliberate to be random. It was a humble creature that could easily penetrate the security of the Domus Aurea, exactly what the gods would use to remind the powerful man of his mortality. The sound's meaning. The chirp was not harmonious. It was discordant, irritating, and insistent. The priests had taught that the gods communicated peace through harmony and warning through discord. The cricket's screeching rhythm was clearly a sound of divine displeasure, a piercing auditory judgment on some recent decree, some forgotten sacrifice, or some personal moral failure. The prophecy. The emperor's mind dredged up old grim nursery rhymes and warnings from the Vestal virgins. He remembered tales of a certain rhythmic clicking that preceded the catastrophic fire of Rome, or a similar incessant sound that announced the fall of a tyrannical king centuries ago. The cricket's rhythm was now the clock counting down to his own overthrow. It was the sound of fatum, a melody of inevitability. The fear was no longer about assassination by a human hand, which could be fought and countered. This fear was spiritual. It was a direct indictment from Jupiter, Mars, or the Furies themselves. The emperor had once proudly declared himself a divus, a god among men. Now, a small, earthly creature was delivering a simple, beloved pet. In many homes, especially among the poor who could not afford luxurious pets, crickets were deliberately kept in small, decorative cages woven from reeds or willow. They were cherished for their song. A quiet evening spent listening to the house cricket was considered a simple pleasure, a charming amenity that required no taxes, no elaborate care, and no worrying political machinations. It was a sound that grounded the listener to the earth and the simple cycle of the seasons. The emperor, however, had spent his life actively eradicating these simple comforts. His doctors, his guards, and his obsession with silence had created a sterile bubble where any natural sound was a hostile intrusion. The cricket that chirped in the emperor's golden palace was chemically and culturally unrecognizable to him. He lived in a world where every object had a price, every action a political consequence, and every person a hidden agenda. He could only assign this terrifying weight to the cricket song. It was expensive, it was dangerous, and it was a conspiracy. The emperor, staring out at the chaotic, noisy city he ruled, stood on his marble balcony as an exile in his own empire. The plebeians below, the tired artisans and the small merchants, knew the comfort of that sound. They knew its meaning was peace. But the emperor, in his vast, silent luxury, knew only its terror. The cricket, therefore, serves as a poignant, acoustic line drawn in the sand. On one side, the natural, enduring, comforting world of the ordinary Roman. On the other, the paranoid, luxurious, and terrifying isolation of the ultimate ruler. The emperor's sleepless night was a product not of the cricket's noise, but of his profound, absolute separation from the simple, grounded life that embraced that noise as a charm. Good evening, and welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. We have explored the general anxieties of the Roman emperor. Now let's focus our gaze on one specific historical figure whose neuroses made him a prime candidate for the cricket's terror: Caligula's aversion, a specific historical emperor and his extreme sensitivity to sound. Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, better known by his childhood nickname Caligula, Little Boots, was Rome's third emperor. His reign, though brief, 37 to 41 CE, was marked by escalating madness, extravagance, and, crucially for our story, a profound, almost pathological sensitivity to the sensory world. Caligula embodies the psychological breakdown that absolute power can induce, turning the gentle sounds of nature into instruments of torture. The noise of the navy. Caligula's aversion to noise was historically documented, though not always related to insects. Suetonius, in his biographical work, noted that Caligula was particularly distressed by the sound of thunder. While fear of a storm is natural, Caligula's reaction was extreme. He would often hide beneath his bed or attempt to flee the palace entirely, displaying a childlike terror of any powerful, unpredictable sound. This established a critical precedent. The emperor feared what he could not control. His famous, bizarre attempt to build a pontoon bridge 3 miles long across the Bay of Baiae was partly an act of engineering spectacle, but also an obsessive attempt to out-thunder the gods, to prove that human noise and human will could surpass the arbitrary power of nature. The soft tyrant. Caligula lived in an environment of total sensory indulgence. He dressed in silks, ate foods seasoned with the most exotic spices, and bathed in oils and perfumes. As we discussed earlier, this soft living eroded his tolerance for the rough edges, the nocturnal creature to change its instinctual song. His authority, vast as it was, stopped precisely at the boundary of a tiny insect's will. The vanity of wealth. His palace, the Domus Aurea, was built to isolate him, a marble fortress intended to filter out all imperfection. But the cricket's sound penetrated the thickest walls and the heaviest draperies, proving that the most extravagant wealth could not purchase perfect peace or perfect control. The simplicity of the sound utterly humiliated the complexity of the security apparatus built to protect him. The fragility of the ego. The emperor's fear was rooted in his belief that he was the most important variable in the universe. The cricket, by simply existing and chirping, reduced him to a frantic, sleepless man trying to swat away an irritant. It showed him that the cosmos, far from being concerned with his decrees, proceeded with its own simple, unrelenting rhythm, entirely regardless of his anxieties. This was the cricket's profound lesson. Power is not control. The emperor controlled people, laws, and armies, but he did not control life itself. The sound, now gone, left behind a silence that was terrifyingly full of the memory of his own helplessness. He finally stood, walking to a small table where a golden laurel wreath rested, the symbol of his triumph and his absolute authority. He picked it up, feeling its familiar cold weight, and for the first time, the weight felt less like power and more like a heavy, decorative chain. He knew that the guards, though silent, had seen his weakness. They had seen the Divus reduced to a terrified man hunting a bug. He had failed the ultimate test of authority, maintaining an illusion of unflappable strength. The cricket was dead or dispersed, but its lesson was permanent. The emperor's endless war against internal fears had found its most unlikely general in a humble field creature. He had won the battle for silence, but he had lost the war for peace, learning in the most humiliating way possible that even the ruler of the world must submit to the simple, random, and ultimately indifferent forces of nature. Good evening, and welcome to the quiet conclusion of our story. The sun has fully risen over the Roman Empire. The terrifying sounds have been silenced, the nervous pacing has stopped, and our emperor, though physically exhausted, is settling into a moment of sober reflection. We end our journey tonight with these final thoughts on power and the peaceful chirp. The morning after the ordeal, the silence that enveloped the palace was unlike the false quiet